One of the common mistakes that new quilters make, and even some of us old timers, is if I have a square piece of fabric that is, let's just say, for example, 3 inches, and I sew it to another 3-inch square, I should end up with something that is 6 inches long, right? Wrong. Because in the world of Quilty Math, you will know that 3 plus 3 is actually 5.5. Makes sense, right? Totally does not. But by the end of this video, you'll understand why. So let's get started. Hello, Treasure Hearties. I'm Eric, your Treasure Heart creator, back with part 2 in our Quilty Math series. In part 1, we focused in on calculations surrounding squares and how we take the finished size of a block and do the math to figure out what size squares or units we need to make up that finished size. This was something I called the breakdown method. But in this video, we're going to work in the opposite direction. We'll take our individual squares and work the math so we can figure out what size quilting unit or what size block we can make with it. This will help you understand the math in figuring out the length of a strip or a rectangle needed when attaching it to a number of sewn squares or quilting units. So let's not waste any time and let's just dive right into the math. So there is a quilting rule that, well, I sort of kind of made up. I call it the 1/2 inch seam allowance rule. I haven't heard anybody else in the quilting world actually mention this rule. So don't quote me on this like it's something official, because I am definitely not the quilting police. What is this rule and what's the importance of it? So here I have 2 squares that measure 5 inches. If I were to sew these 2 together, the unit will not be 10 inches long. It'll be 9.5. So here is the same, or another 2 5-inch squares. They originally started as 5-inch squares, and then now I have there, I sewed it together, so there's a seam right here in the middle. And now when I measure the length of this, yep, it's not 10 inches, it's actually 9.5. Now this 1/2 inch seam allowance or 1/2 inch seam rule is that anytime you put a seam between 2 different units, whether they be squares, whether they be rectangles, maybe they're strips, anytime you have a seam, the overall length of the unit is actually going to be 1/2 inch shorter. Why 1/2 inch? Remember that 1/4 inch seam allowance? Yeah, it takes away 1/4 inch on one fabric, but it also takes 1/4 inch away from the other fabric. Let's take this navy blue, for example. It started off as 5 inches, now it's 4 3/4 big, or 4 3/4 in length. Same thing with the white. Okay, it started off as a 5-inch square. Now it also is 4 3/4. 4 3/4 plus 4 3/4, 9.5. So again, 1/2 inch seam allowance rule or 1/2 inch seam rule is that anytime you have a seam, you're going to lose 1/2 inch. Now that we know this 1/2 inch seam rule, well, how do we actually use it? Let's go back to this quilting unit here. Now remember, each of these squares started off as a 5-inch square, unfinished. But now that we have the seam here, we lost 1/2 inch on the length. So if we say 5 inches plus 5 inches minus 1/2 inch because of the seam allowance, 5 plus 5, 10, minus 1/2, 9.5 inches. That's what the length of this new unit is. Now, what if your unit has multiple seams, either in a row or in the same column? Let's have a look at this quilt block here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each of these 4 squares, the original unfinished size was 2.5 inches. 2.5 inches plus 2.5 inches plus 2.5 plus another 2.5. That's actually the same thing as saying 2.5 multiplied by 4. Is that 9? Yep, that's 9. Nope, that's 10 inches. Give me a break, guys. It's about 12 midnight right now when I'm filming this. Even I second guess my own calculations here. But 2.5 plus 2.5, that's 5, plus another 2.5, that's 7.5, plus another 2.5, 10 inches. Now, how many seams are there? There's one seam here, another seam here, and another seam here. So 1/2 inch times 3, that is 1.5. So if I take the 10 minus the 1.5 for each of the seam allowances, that'll give me 8.5. Okay. So I know this looks a little bit more complicated, so let me simplify it for you here. Okay. We're going to take the size or unfinished, finished size of each of the individual units. Whether those units are squares, well, they're more likely going to be squares. Okay. Multiply that by the number of units, and you'll come up with a measurement. I'm just going to call it X for now. Now take the number of seams, multiply that by 1/2, you'll come up with a different number. Take X minus Y, and this will give you the length of the new unit. Now let's have a little bit of a quiz just to test your knowledge. The 3 squares that you see here, well, each of them measures 3 inches unfinished. Now, if I were to sew these 3 squares together, what will the length of the new unit be? Will it be A, 9 inches, B, 8 inches, or C, neither of the two? The correct answer is B, 8 inches. All right, let's try a little bit more of a trickier one here. There's 2 rows of half-square triangles. Now the top row is not sewn together, but the bottom row is. The top row has 8 1.5 inch unfinished half-square triangles. The bottom row, well, the total length of that row measures 8.5 inches. If I take the top row and sew all of those 1.5 inch unfinished half-square triangles together, is that going to be A, be too long to match to the bottom row, or B, it'll be just the right size, or C, it's going to be too short? The answer is B again. It'll be just the right size. Now let's get into one of my favorite blocks, the log cabin, which will be one of your challenge blocks for this video. Now here's the log cabin block, and the reason why I chose this block is because, well, number one, it is my favorite block. Just a little biased, I know. But number two, this log cabin block will challenge you when it comes to getting the right measurement of each of these strips that you have to cut and sew and attach to the previous unit. If you've made a log cabin block, well, you kind of know what I mean by this when you say you build the block from the inside or from the center outward. But if you've never made a log cabin block, well, here's your 10-second crash course on this. Now, traditionally, a log cabin usually starts with the center square that is a red colored fabric. We're not going to do a traditional style. You can basically just choose any color fabric that you want to. And log cabins, well, people do that center square in various sizes. Some go as small as 1.5, and some go as large as 2.5 inches. Now, the larger the square, the larger each of these strips that get sewn or attached to it. I mean, it basically, you want to keep it to the same width. There are variations to the log cabin quilt where you might start off with the width in one size, but as you keep going outward, each of the widths of each of the width of each of the strips, well, they can vary, but let's not make it too complicating. Let's just make it simple for now. And let's just say whatever width or whatever size square that you want to start off with here in the center, just make each of those strips the same width, just to keep it simple. So you start off your log cabin with that center square, then you're going to attach a square of a different print next to it. Okay. Now let me turn it this way. Now with these two squares, you're going to sew a strip next to it, but it's going to be the same length as those two squares. Now, let me turn it again. You got the two squares, you got this strip here. Now, all of these are prints. Now you're going to attach a background strip that matches the length of this right here. Okay, we'll turn it again. You got your original square there, square here, print of a rectangle or a strip here, and then you got your background. You attach another background strip going the length of this part of that unit. And you're going to keep doing that. And notice that I'm rotating it here. Now you had a background, we'll go back to the print. And now the print has to be the length of this here. Turn it again. We're adding this print on and making sure that it's the full length of this here. And you'll keep going around and around until you get your full block. Now this block will finish at 12 inches. Now I know I just went through those instructions a little quickly in terms of how to construct a log cabin quilt block. Now if you need more detailed information or if you need more detailed instructions, I did do a previous tutorial as part of my 52 weeks, 52 blocks series, and you can check it out. Link is in the description below, or we'll have a link for you at the end of this video. Now, with the log cabin, we are going to do a log cabin quilt setting or design setting. Take a look at what you see behind me. This will give you an idea as to how this quilt is going to look like with the 12-inch block. Now, I made 18 log cabin quilt blocks for my quilt top. Now, you don't have to make all 18 of them all at once. If you want to just do one or two every time a new video comes out, well, that's fine. In fact, you might want to do that because, well, you may change your mind about what color strips you want to use. You may even change your mind about what size strips you want to use. Speaking of which, the size strip that I used was 2 inches wide, but you don't have to go 2 inches wide. You can go 2.5. You can go 1.5, or if you dare to, you can even do a 1-inch strip. That choice is up to you. So long as your finished block will finish to a 12-inch size, you'll be okay. Now remember, in the first video, we actually discussed the Irish chain design layout in which we're going to use 6-inch blocks. Now, you don't have to do both of them. You can just pick and choose which one you want to do, whether you want to do 12-inch blocks with this log cabin setting, or you can do the 6-inch blocks with the Irish chain setting. Or, by special request, we did have one person, well, They wanted to find out how to actually set a quilt on point. So we're going to be adding that, and those will be 8-inch blocks. But there's a little trick to that. You see, if you decided to do the Irish chain setting, but then when you see the final quilt, when it's on point, you might all of a sudden want to change your mind. So yeah, if you have, or if you started making your challenge blocks and you did it in the 6-inch size, now that you see the log cabin setting, you might want to switch it up. Well, those 6-inch blocks are not going to go to waste, because guess what? If you do, or if you know the math, a 6.5-inch and a 6.5-inch, combine all four of them, what size is that? Aha, now you can understand why I chose these two particular sizes, because they kind of fit together pretty nicely, if in case you change your mind midway through. But the on-point quilt, well, you're going to take that 6.5-inch block and you're going to sew strips around it. See, I was thinking about you guys. So again, the log cabin quilt, if you're going to copy or if you're going to mimic whatever I do, you're going to need 18 of them. But there's one additional block in this video in which you're going to have to construct. Let's get into that second challenge block. So take a look at this block here. Wow, there's a lot of colors and a lot of strips and a lot of squares. Now, again, this block finishes at 12 inches. It is in a 4-patch setting here, because there's one square here. There's one square there. Let me move my rotary cutter out of the way. One square there, another one here, and another one here. So again, the finished size of this quilt block is 12 inches, which should tell you the size of each of these individual units. Now, if you don't want to make a 12-inch block and you are doing the Irish chain setting, or if you're going to do the quilt on point, you can just make one of these. But by sheer knowledge of the fact that this is a 12-inch block, you should know the size of what this individual unit, or this quarter of that 12-inch block, should be. Now, to break down this block even further, let's just take a look at one of the individual units here. So here's one of them, or one of the 4 major units here. Let's focus in on this here for a second. Okay, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 squares sewn right across. Now, on the other unit, or as I like to call it, the complementary unit, this is one solid strip here. Now, I had the option, since I know that I have 6 squares here, I could have actually cut 6 squares here of this same fabric, but I wanted to actually save the fabric a little bit, because, well, if I cut it as one solid piece, I'm actually going to save some of that fabric. But if I just really was tired, or I couldn't figure out the math, well, I would have had the option of cutting each individual, or cutting this down into individual squares. Okay, but this unit here should be the same size as this unit there. Now, if you can figure out the measurements for one of these units, then creating the other 3, that's going to be no problem. Okay. Now, the other thing to point out, there is a center, there is a center 4-patch right there. Now, I can choose to actually do that as one solid square, but I chose to do it as a 4-patch. Take note of this one, though. Here, I actually did do it as one solid piece, because, well, it's the same fabric of the background square, sort of. So to repeat, or to reiterate, this quilt block finishes at 12 inches. That should give you the size of each of these individual units here, because it is laid out in a 4-patch. Now, to break it down even further, the 4 patch has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 squares going across, 6 squares going down. What do you know? That is actually a 36 patch. Yes, 36 patch. There is a such thing. Okay. Now, we did talk a little bit about strip sets, and if you want to make a strip set to create these individual squares here, by all means, that's what you can do. That's up to you. Personally, I already had these size squares cut out in my scrap stash, so I just sewed the individual squares together. But if you want to make a strip set out of it and you want to subcut it to those individual squares, that's up to you. In fact, you might want to just give it a try. See if it's possible. There's an ethical question that I think I should address given the topic of this series. Let's see, what would we call it? Quilt pattern theft or quilt pattern copyright issues? What do I mean by that? There are times where you can take a look at a quilt, you can see the blocks, and without even knowing the pattern, if you know basics about quilting math and quilt block construction or patchwork construction, you can kind of tell how the block is constructed. Case in point, hop, skip, and jump. This is one of those blocks where after a while and after some experience of quilting, I can take a look at that block and start to dissect it and then figure out how to construct it. And that's where the question of ethics comes in, because some people, myself included, yes, I will admit, they'll take a look at the pattern, they'll study the block, and instead of purchasing the pattern, they will figure it all out in their head and they will go home and make the quilt. Is that ethical though? In my opinion, no. Do I do it anyway? Okay, yeah, I will admit that, yes, I do that anyway. So this is kind of a controversy among quilt pattern writers and quilt pattern designers, or quilt designers in general. I mean, they understand that experienced quilters can take a look at a block and they can start dissecting it to the point where they don't need to buy the pattern. They just take a look at the quilt and they can tell, okay, yep, we're going to make this many half square triangles or this many squares, cut it to this certain size, and you can sew it and put the block together. And they've been raising that ethical question that to say, hey, you know, if you want to support the quilt pattern designer or pattern maker, well, you need to buy the pattern. But in response to that, though, I also think that if you gotta make the quilt block or the quilt top, whatever it is, I mean, you gotta make it pretty intricate so that someone feels the need to buy the pattern itself. Now, in a quilt like this is the tulip pink butterfly pattern. The individual blocks that make up the quilt, I mean, they're simple enough that I could probably just look at it and dissect it and put it together. But when a pattern is like this, where it's pretty complex and intricate to lay all the blocks out and put the entire quilt top together, yeah, that's not easy to do just by looking at the quilt. It's possible, but yeah, you're better off just spending the money buying the pattern. Would I spend money purchasing this pattern? If it didn't come with the fabric or if it didn't come in a kit, I probably would not spend money on the pattern. But in contrast, when the quilt is a little bit more intricate, a little bit more complex to put together, case in point, this quilt, putting the quilt top together, that was pretty intricate because you have different size blocks all coming together to form the butterfly design. And so for me, in my opinion, this pattern was worth the purchase. So you got two different extremes here where on one hand, I can take a look at a picture of the quilt block and start dissecting it. And then on the other hand, well, I definitely need the pattern to figure out how to make the quilt or how to put the quilt top together. But a lot of people have differing opinions on this. in that they don't feel like it's theft if they just take a look at the quilt pattern, and if they can figure it out on themselves, then it's not considered theft because, well, they're just looking at a picture for inspiration, but they actually have to do the work and all the numbers and calculations in the background in their own head. They don't have the benefit of having a pattern that figured all of that out for you. There's also another question when it comes to quilt patterns. Some quilters believe that one person can purchase the pattern and they can lend the pattern out to someone else or another quilter, perhaps one of their friends. Is that right? Well, honestly, my own personal opinion is I kind of have mixed feelings about that. Well, at least it's better than, not paying anything at all, just taking a look at a picture and start dissecting it. And at least the pattern designer or the pattern writer, the creator of the quilt pattern, at least they're getting something. Think about this. Say, for example, somebody needs a rotary cutter because their rotary cutter, well, I don't know, maybe the blade went dull, maybe they lost their rotary cutter, and they need that, or they asked to borrow your rotary cutter to complete a quilt. Is that considered theft? Well, it is considered theft if they never return the rotary cutter. But why is it then that even if I lend out a quilting pattern and I get the pattern back, why is that theft? Now, I also know some quilting circles or quilting friends where they all kind of pool their money together. They buy one pattern and they share it among all of them. Is that considered theft? Some people do consider that to be theft, although they will admit that at least the pattern maker or the pattern designer, the person selling the pattern, they're getting something out of it. They're not maybe getting the full purchase of everyone purchasing their own individual pattern, but at least they're getting something. Well, here's a third situation. And this one, every quilter that I've spoken to, they all kind of agree that this one really is theft. If I buy a pattern, regardless of whether or not it's an easy pattern where I can figure it out just by looking at the picture, or if it's a more intricate pattern, if I purchase either one of those and I make Xerox copies and I give it to some of my friends, yeah, all the quilters that I've spoken to, they kind of across the board all agree that's theft. That's not right. So why am I asking this ethical question? Well, part of the reason why this video series took a while for me to get rolling with is because, well, here I am saying that on one hand, if you take a look at the picture on a quilt pattern and you see the quilt block and you start dissecting it, well, here I am saying it's theft, but here I am also giving you the tools to do just that. And so I had to kind of ponder this ethical question very seriously because, well, I'm saying don't do it, but in case you want to do it, here's how to do it. I ended up just going ahead with this quilting series because, well, for two main reasons. Number one, sometimes the pattern writers or the pattern designers, whoever develops the quilt, they don't always get the math right. And usually a pattern writer or pattern designer, whatever you want to call them, before they start selling the pattern out to the general public, they will usually have a few quilters test the pattern. They read the pattern and they will follow it step by step verbatim. And to make sure that, number one, are the steps clear, and number two, is the math behind all of the cutting and construction, is the math correct? And most of the time, these pattern testers, they will catch errors like that. But sometimes those errors kind of get overlooked. In addition, patterns are basically the reflection of the designer themselves. Case in point, let's take the construction of half square triangle units. I mean, there's a million different ways to do them. Some of them you can do it 2 at a time. Some people like to do it 1 at a time. Each of these various methods, well, they require different size fabric units or fabric pieces. And some of them are a little bit more complex than others. And so if, for example, you have a pattern where the designer or the pattern writer gives you instructions on how to do it 8 at a time, but you don't necessarily like to do it that way, well, guess what? You're in a bit of a pickle because the instructions in the pattern say how to do it 8 at a time, which you don't like to do. And if you don't know the math behind the basic HST construction, well, you're kind of stuck. The second reason is because sometimes a pattern only gives you one size. What if you want to take that same block and resize it to something different? For example, this pattern, the block finishes at 12 inches. But what if I don't want to make a 12-inch block? What if I want to put it to 8 inches? Or what if I want to make it 6 inches? If you don't know the math behind some of these basic construction or the construction behind these basic quilting units, you're kind of stuck. So when I really thought about it, weighing the pros and cons behind this ethical issue, I said, the pros kind of outweigh the cons, so let's go ahead and do this. Now let me make this clear. The intention really is to teach you the math behind some of these basic quilting units so that you can actually start designing your own quilt blocks. Or again, if you have a quilt block or if you have a quilt pattern that only gives one size and you want to resize it, well, now you know how to do it. But what's your opinion on this whole ethical question? I mean, do you think it is or it should be considered theft if you can take a look at a picture of a quilt block based off of someone's quilt pattern and then start dissecting the block? Is that theft? Or if I have one of my quilting friends borrow a pattern that I purchased and they do return it back, is that theft? How about the other situation where all of me and my quilting friends kind of chip in to purchase one copy of a quilt pattern and we all share it together? Is that theft? Put a comment down below. I would be very, very interested to hearing what all of you have to say about this. You know, I used to think that quilts made up of just squares or rectangles or just plain square-ish shapes, well, I used to think they were kind of boring. I mean, seriously, how creative can you get with just a simple 9-patch block? But over the years, I've been proven wrong because I've seen various styles of quilts, and I have learned that just because it's just squares or squarish shapes, that doesn't exactly make it boring. And I've learned a thing or two on how to make beautiful quilts with just only squares or strips. So I created a collection of pictures and video clips of quilts I have created or seen at quilt shows to show you how simple quilts can look very complex but very beautiful. So the following quilts are quilts that I saw at the Desert Quilters of Nevada's Quilt Guild show. There you can kind of see who is the maker of the quilt as well as the quilter. But what I liked about this quilt was not just the fact that it had Hawaiian prints, but look at the quilt design. It's just basic rectangles, and that gray fabric is used to kind of create a shadow effect. Simple in design with just square or square-ish shapes and strips. Here's another example. Same design layout, but this time it just uses squares. There's the maker as well as the quilter. And take a note that instead of using the gray strip like the other quilt that we just saw, this one uses a black strip to create that shadow effect. Now, if you're curious of what this quilt design layout is called, well, it's usually called shadow. Now, this quilt is laid out in what is commonly referred to as the trip around the world. There you can see the quilter and the maker of this quilt, as well as the title of the quilt. What makes this quilt very unique is it's totally made up of just squares. But the placement of these squares and the prints on them, that's what creates the pattern of the quilt. Visually, this is a very stunning quilt. And it looks complicated, but if you know the technique on how to create this quilt, it's actually quite simple. Here's another example of a trip around the world quilt. But notice that this quilter actually used larger squares. There again you can see the name of the quilt, the maker of the quilt, as well as the quilter. What I liked about this version of the trip around the world was just the color combination. The reds, the pinks matched with that print floral fabric, as well as the green and the dark green colors. Again, it made for a very visually stunning quilt. Let's have a look at this quilt. It's just simple 9 patches mixed in with a solid background square. There you can see the name of the quilt, the quilter, and the maker, and look at that, it won a ribbon. The layout on this quilt, well, it just makes it look like strips that were woven together like in a basket weave, which hence the name, woven. This is a creative use of just squares and 9 patch units. One of my favorite quilt blocks to make is the log cabin. Now, part of the reason why I love making log cabins is number 1, it's fairly simple to make. But number 2, when you get all your blocks done and you start to lay out the quilt, there are a number of different quilt layouts that you can do. Here's an example of the trip around the world layout. And again, this is just simple squares and strips kind of arranged in a very methodical way, but it makes for a very stunning quilt. And there you can see the name of the quilt, the maker of the quilt, as well as the quilter. And look at that, it won a ribbon as well. Here's another example of a log cabin quilt. Now there you can see the name of the quilt, the maker of the quilt, as well as the quilter. Now take note on this particular quilt top, or this particular quilt, the center of each of the blocks, well, it has another quilt block, yet showing the versatility of the log cabin. One final and, shall I say, patriotic version of a log cabin. And there you can see the name of the quilt, the maker of the quilt, and look at that, it's another ribbon winner. Take note that the center of the quilt block, or the log cabin, has that star, and also take note of the color placement of each of those red, white, and blue strips. It's that color placement that gives this quilt a very stunning look. Well, I hope you realize that squares and strips or rectangles in quilts may not be so boring after all. Moreover, I hope that you have an understanding of the quilting math behind these basic shapes because, well, if you get a good grasp on this, then you can build and expand your knowledge base and you'll be on your way to designing your own quilt blocks. In the coming videos, we're going to expand on what you just learned, and we're going to start looking at the math and construction of different quilting units, and how combining these various quilting units, well, they can create some very interesting blocks. Remember, if you have questions or need help understanding concepts explained in this video or any of the videos in this series, well, I am hosting Zoom meetings where you can ask these questions and get answers live, not just from me, but from the others on the Zoom. So if you're interested in this, send me an email to treasureheartcreations@gmail.com. I'll get you that information. Now in the next video, we will discuss everybody's favorite quilting unit, the half square triangle. Then we'll go into how sewing a small little accent fabric can change the entire look of a quilt block or maybe the entire quilt. We call it the snowball effect. And somewhere down in the future, we will have a video about how to construct flying geese units or even doing quarter square triangles. That's a lot to look forward to. So let's get sewing our challenge blocks. And until next time, let's all get out there. Let's all make something scrappy. Bye for now.